Welcome to the Pickleball Recovery Podcast, where we highlight products and practices to help you feel better faster, so you can spend less time stiff, sore, and injured, and more time on the court doing what you love.
What's up? Welcome to another episode of Pickleball Recovery. I'm your host, Tim Ringgold. Happy New Year. Wow, we are living in the future, folks, because when I was growing up, 2020 was as far into the future I had ever thought of. Frankly, I didn't think we were going to make it this far. But here we are. It's 2024. What? And so, there's a couple of things that I like to do around the new year. One is to kind of reflect on the year, think about my wins. And then, for the new year, what is it I want to create and experience for myself? I have found that to be a very rewarding practice. And I pass that on to you because it's easy to not stop and smell the roses. But, you accomplished a lot last year, whether you're present to that or not. And the brain is wired for, negativity and recency. So it's easy to forget the good stuff. That's not unusual. So it takes a little bit of a practice to go back and what were your wins for the year? A couple of my wins for the year in pickleball was that I got onto the senior pro podium twice, silver in singles and a silver in men's doubles. Very happy about that. That kind of validated my experience as playing up. I'm still punching way above my weight, you guys. My duper is 4.7 something in doubles and only 4.99 or 4.98 in singles. So I'm, punching above my weight whenever possible because I don't want to sandbag and I just don't want to bother. It's just easier to just play up, and that's how you get better. Just take your beatings. And so it was cool to finally, put together a couple of results. That felt great. What else felt great was, despite my head injury, I had no muscle injuries all year. And what a difference compared to 2022. What a difference. So super, super happy. Want to celebrate that. So let's get into today, okay? Today is a really good conversation with the host of the Healthy Pickleballer podcast, Dr. Brien Lee. And I've been a guest on his podcast, and now it was time for him to be a guest on mine. Let me tell you, we get into some conversation about the back and about joints and their purpose that are really useful for you to understand. And the couple of exercises that he recommends in this podcast, I immediately added them to my morning routine. So really good stuff waiting for you in this episode. So sit back, relax, enjoy the ride, like and subscribe. Haha. And I'll see you on the other side.
Brien Lee, welcome to Pickleball Recovery.
Thanks for having me, Tim. Happy to be here.
Yeah, it's great. So happy that we're, doing this again. Trying to remember, I guess we just kind of first met on Instagram, and then was I on your podcast before we hung out in Denver or after? I can't remember the order of operations.
You were on my podcast, and then we got to meet in person for the first time at the PPA event in Denver.
That's cool. Now, where is home for you again?
I'm currently in Atlanta. At the time, I was living in Denver. So just moved back to Atlanta a couple months ago.
All right. Right on. Welcome back. My second favorite tour stop on the PPA tour was the PPA Atlanta. I think that's the Lifetime. I don't know if it's called Buckhead or Peachtree or, the one with the super steep, amphitheater.
Yeah, they just had the MLP event at that same location back in September, and that was a really great venue and great outing.
Yeah, that's a cool spot. Beautiful. The whole facility is gorgeous. So anyhow, here we are, and we are kind of kindred spirits. Both like to play pickleball, both like to help people who are in pain from playing pickleball. And it's a problem that we see everywhere we go. And tell people just kind of a little bit of your background as a clinician and a little bit of a background as a pickleballer.
Yeah, so I would say, I'm a physical therapist that specializes in helping pickleball players to move better, helping them to reduce the risk for injury on the court. And I would say that, I really consider myself somebody who's been specializing in it for, about a year now. And, that really stems from, as the game's continuing to grow, is almost going to be inevitable that you're going to come across a pickleball player who needs your services. So I was working with a client who would have a little issue pop up here and there, and we'd kind of continue to work on one area, get that feeling better, and then something else would come up. And as a good physical therapist should do, that led me to looking into pickleball, studying it a little bit more. And I have a competitive tennis background growing up, so naturally I was interested in a racket and a ball sport. So eventually that client actually got me out onto the court. And from that moment on, I was not only going to be a physical therapist that was helping clients, but I also wanted to be in the action as well. And I've been playing, consistently and regularly ever since.
Yep. It happens. I remember after my first lesson, and I hadn't ever played. I just took a lesson, it's like, here's a paddle, here's a ball. It was one-on-one. And I was like, oh, right. And the little did the guy know that in my clinical world, I work in substance use treatment. And so he texted me, he's like, welcome to your new addiction. And at first I was like, don't say such things. But then I realized, oh, you're totally right. Pickleball suffers, it's like almost identical. The only thing that's different is you don't feel the shame after you've played. But you plan on it, you think about it, you dedicate more and more time towards it. It's like, it's very similar, but that's great. And kudos for oh, okay, my guy is, hurting. Why? What is this thing and how does it hurt people? So going to take a look at that, kind of like Sherlock Holmes, what are the clues here?
Yeah, it's such an important thing that we should do as physical therapists. It's sometimes when we get people, we're in the clinic seeing them, and we can sometimes get caught up on focusing on range of motion and strength and doing just strength training, but forgetting that there's stuff happening outside the court that we need to be taking a look at. How well are they moving on the court? What do their mechanics look like? Do I need to get this person in to also see a coach when they're playing, because their technique on maybe their wrist flick isn't ideal or ergonomically sound? So I think it's really important for us to be aware of those type of things.
Yeah, totally. Well said. In fact, in 2022, I had no trainer. I had a coach, but no trainer. And so my skills were getting better, but I kept injuring myself during tournaments. And it wasn't until I combined the two and had both, then it was well, it doesn't matter how good my hands are if I'm constantly injuring myself. So it was now I need a trainer to look at my body while I'm hitting, functional movements,
Mm-hmm.
And what I liked about it was, one of the trainers had his doctorate in physical therapy. The other one had his MS in I don't know if it was exercise science. I can't remember, but he had his MS. So he was a pretty high level trainer as well. And they wanted to see me with my paddle in my hand. And I loved that, because to your point, until you see somebody, how they're moving while they're doing what they're doing, the functional application of strength and range of motion and mobility, it's kind of irrelevant, it's kind of abstract, right? And it's oh, when you do this, you do that, right? And I've had two really great mentors along the way helping me with that, and having no very little racket background. I'm a soccer player. When I swing, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm kind of making it up as I go along.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's real easy to make up bad habits when you don't know what you're doing. And if there's no one watching your body while you're doing it. And even if you watch video of yourself, you can see you doing it, but you may not know, how to address it.
Yeah, exactly. I think that, my background comes from actually working in the performing arts world. So I was a physical therapist that traveled on tour with Broadway shows, and
No kidding.
I was backstage with these productions every night. And, so that's really where I learned the importance of, what we're doing in our clinic facility here. We need to make sure that, if I'm teaching you, how to use your shoulder, really focusing on a lot of like strengthening and overhead positions, that when I go up on stage, I need to make sure if you have an overhead lift that you're not going back into those same habits. So even just cueing them on, keeping your ribs down, so you're not putting all that stress on your low back. It could be as simple as just giving them that cue, and then they're in good position.
Wow, that's great. Speaking of low backs, so like early in my pickleball journey, I didn't know how weak my glutes really were, or my quads. And so I'd get to the kitchen and it was all back, right?
Mm-hmm.
Reaching for everything, all back. And what I noticed, like if you, with that at the Ultimate Repair X booth, which I've spent, God, I don't know, 20 plus events at the booth. When I'm not on court, I'm at the booth. The number of people coming in with low back, issues, mid-thoracic issues. They don't know how to say mid-thoracic, they just say back or low back. And a number of issues that I see all the time is just like, overwhelming. And it started with me. And it was funny. I was in Tyson McGuffin's camp, which I highly recommend to anybody listening to this. Great camp. And it was Tyson, the first person who was like hammering us, about not reaching with our back and not hinging with our back and, really activating our glutes. Pardon my French, everybody. He called it pickle ass. And like if your ass isn't on fire at the end of a good dink session, a good training session, then you're not doing it right. So let's talk about low back today and mid-thoracic back. Let's talk back, because so many people are, love the sport, but, are wrecking their back. And so I think there's kind of two ways that I want to kind of take the conversation. One is, what can we do for people who are already blown their backs up and their backs are inflamed and they're irritated and they're injured? And then what can we do for people who are not already on fire, but what can we do that's preventative so that they're moving better, and that they can kind of insulate themselves from back injury?
Yeah, I think that those two things aren't going to be completely different.
Okay.
But let's start with like the people who, maybe are looking to prevent that low back stuff from developing. When we look at a sport like pickleball, I call it like the choreography of the game. There's certain movement patterns that you see pop up throughout the game pretty often. So they're getting these repetitive movements.
Yes.
So when I look at that, I think about a hip hinge, which you mentioned. I think about like a lunge, specifically kind of forward and to the side. So those things come up very often in the game. So immediately with anybody that comes in that plays pickleball, I want to see how well they do those three movements.
Nice.
And as I'm watching their movement patterns, it's giving me an idea of what's moving well and what's not moving well. And oftentimes one of the big like limiting factors for people is like a limitation in hip mobility. And pickleball it's a rotation sport. So There's a lot of twisting and rotating that's happening. And oftentimes the low back is the area that kind of is where the symptoms develop, but it's oftentimes not usually where a lot of the issues arise.
Nailed it. Love that.
Are you familiar? It's not like a perfect model, but have you ever heard of like the joint by joint approach?
No.
So in the body, like if you're talking about like the anatomy, there are certain parts of the body that are designed more anatomically to serve the purpose of mobility, and some joints that are designed more for stability. And it's kind of like this alternating sequence that as you go up like throughout the kinetic chain. So like if you start at your ankles, much more of a mobility joint. You can move your ankle around in a bunch of different directions.
Yep.
Your knee is a more of a hinge joint designed more for stability.
Okay.
And then going into the hip, more of a ball and socket joint again. You can rotate it and move it around.
Yep.
And then the low back, with the orientation of what we call like facet joints and disc, a lot of like ligaments in there too to provide more stability. So again, you can kind of see,
Gotcha.
the alternating sequence there.
Yep.
So in the case of like when your hip joint isn't moving very well, oftentimes up the chain or down the chain, something typically like is going to compensate for that limitation. But based off what we just talked about, the low back and the knee aren't really designed for to give all of that mobility. And then over time, that's what can cause these issues to develop, is when that back we're putting too much stress on that back in those kind of positions.
That's really, really insightful. I'd never heard about that alternating purpose and alternating function model. And so it makes a lot of sense to me. And it also makes a lot of sense. I like that you said, look up or down the chain, and I think it's really interesting. Like that gets me thinking now instantly about like, okay, if I'm having symptoms in one of my joints, it could be that joint, but just as easily could be the up or below one. You go up one link, go down one link, right? There could be weakness, or there could be a lack of mobility, in necessary mobility. And as you mentioned, compensation is what we all do. And boy, are athletes good compensators, as my trainer, Kyle Valerie, loves to say. And when you watch people play pickleball, wow, the compensation of how you see them move, especially at the kitchen, it's like no two bodies are the same. Everybody's kind of making it up as they go along.
Yeah. I mean, athletes are some of the greatest compensators because, their primary goal is to get out there and win. So, they're going to use their body in whatever way they need to get the job done.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I love, when I had back pain, the first thing that Kyle worked on was my hip mobility.
Mm-hmm.
We just went to work, and I always knew I had tight hips. Like that's the way I described my hips. I just knew. I was like, I got tight hips. And I think it stemmed from a period of time where I dipped my toe into the yoga world, and like, any kind of range of motion limitations get exploited or found out really quickly in vinyasa flow. So it was like, oh my goodness, look at that. I can't do this and I can't do that. Okay. And so that was like right away. He's like, okay, your hips don't move the way they need to, and it's wrecking everything else as a result of it. So we're just going to dive into your hips. And when I'm good about doing hip mobility stuff, everything works better. And if I take my eye off it because there's no fire, which is like, isn't it so funny, dude? Like I have these like preventative exercises, maintenance exercises, and they're not complicated and they don't take a lot of time. But it's like, I feel good. I don't need them. And it's like, you feel good because you used them, and so you need to keep doing it. And you're just like, why does this not sink in?
Yeah. And then one thing that, your trainer, they did really well there too, is that they went ahead and started addressing the hip mobility right away.
Yep.
That's a perfect example of like where if you just go straight into the core and start doing all this stability work, but you haven't addressed that mobility restriction in the hip, every time you go to lunge and reach for that ball, if you can't sit into that hip, but your goal is to get down to that ball, you're gonna have to compensate and likely bend, from that lower back area. And it's not that bending from the low back is a bad thing. Your spine is designed to move, but it's when it becomes the compensatory movement, that's when it usually becomes the issue.
Yeah, when you're asking something to do what it's not designed to do, it will let you know pretty quickly. Like I was struggling with psoas stuff that would start in my hip flexor, but move, since the psoas moves up into the back, it would end up along the spine. And, one of the things we realized was when I go to move, I would pull my legs with my psoas rather than drive off my glute. And just like that idea of a push instead of a pull movement, in terms of, locomotion, it completely changed the health of my hip flexors and my low back. And like, knock on wood, but I was having, hip flexor issues from the time I was 13, 14 until 2022. Like always struggling with hip flexors because I never realized that I was compensating for just weak glutes by pulling and having these tiny muscles comparatively, these psoas muscles, these hip flexors, try to do all the heavy lifting, in this case, quite literally lifting my legs and pulling them instead of letting the big muscles do the drive. So, and I also love what you said about the difference between mobility and stability, like going to work on, because I'm of the age where you go in the gym and you lift weights, and then it's like, that's an irrelevant conversation if there's no mobility, right? Irrelevant.
Right. Yeah, and I think I also say mobility from the standpoint that mobility also entails being able to control the range of motion. So it's not, we didn't say that this joint is designed for flexibility. We're just talking about the muscle's passive ability to work through this motion. The joint it's mobile, but you still need to be able to have strength to be able to control it throughout that motion. So having strong glutes, having strong hip flexors is really important.
Yeah. And that's interesting. I think as we started talking about the back, and what's the first thing we did? We just started talking about the hips.
Yeah.
And it's classic, right? It's classic. It's like, it's actually not about the back. It's like, it's like, oh, it's just kidding. It's not really, that's not really the issue. And, sometimes it may be, but a lot of the times it's not.
And then, if we wanted to go to the back and talk a little bit more about that, we could go up a little bit higher from the low back up to maybe more the thoracic spine. Because if we continue that alternating sequence, thoracic spine's a lot more designed to serve the purpose of mobility.
Yep.
It's where we breathe. Our ribs are naturally designed to, expand and close with our breathing pattern. And then the orientation of the facet joints, which is where, the motion of your spine comes from, they're oriented a little bit more in a vertical plane or like more like an incline, which allows them to kind of glide and slide a little bit more for more that rotation type of movement.
Gotcha. So mid back has more mobility built into it. Low back, more stability built into it.
Exactly. Golf is a great sport to look at. When you look at those pros and they're, getting that good rotation on their takeaway and on their follow through, their thoracic spine mobility is really optimal.
Wow. That is a good shout. That's really good. Yeah. When I try to do mid thoracic mobility stuff, like Kyle would just laugh, it's just like, okay, go ahead. No, wait, no, go ahead. It's like, I am. Thanks, buddy. He's like, anytime you're ready. And I'm like, F off. I'm in full, rotation right now. And I didn't know. And I think playing soccer, non-rotational sport, a lot of just, linear movement. You're not using your arms unless you're throwing the ball in. And if you're throwing it in, it's linear. So any of that kind of having to generate torque to produce an outcome, it's not happening up here. And so I was never really trained. I never really trained myself in that kind of mobility. So I was frozen up through that area. I mean, it took us months to kind of break through that, whatever it was, just stiffness or immobility.
Yeah. And like in a sport like pickleball too, it can be very one side dominant too. If you're hitting a lot of forehands, you might just be rotating a lot to one side. And over time, if you haven't maybe tapped into that asymmetry, muscles get developed a lot on one side, that can start to cause you to have, limited mobility going the opposite direction. And I always say, like, injuries, there's like micro trauma or like micro injuries and then macro injuries. The micro ones are the ones that accumulate over time. Macro are the ones that like happen in that moment. And we could even, debate whether that's, really how it happens.
Right.
But it's like an hourglass. When you're out there playing, that's like, that sand is running through that hourglass slowly. It's stress on your body. And if you're not doing things to kind of replenish that sand, then eventually it's going to run out. So you might not be having any pain or discomfort now, but that stress is taking its toll, and it might catch up to you eventually if you're not paying attention to these type of things.
Oh, 100%. In fact, at the booth, I have to explain this to people all the time. They just don't understand. And I I love your analogy with micro and macro, because one of the things I try to explain to people is, every time you exercise, you damage, you're tearing up the tissue through exercise. And then when you sleep, you're rebuilding that. And then as we age, we need more and more rest in between exercise for that rebuild. And if you don't rest long enough, you leave some of that micro trauma unhealed, and then you stack another micro trauma on it and another one, but it's under the radar. Like you're perceptually, you don't even see any of this happening. You'll feel it happening. Then you have some irritation that causes a pain breakthrough, but that's like 9 events later, and,
Right.
and you're at like 9, and now you start to feel it. And then at 10, you think you have an injury, and then you take a day off and you go back to like 8, and you're like, I'm good. And then you go back out, and it takes 1 day and it's back. Right. And it's because you have this bedrock of trauma that you haven't healed yet, and like, we just don't think that way. And I, even as an athlete growing up in the 80s, as a competitive athlete, like just the science behind it, we just didn't know as much as we know now. Right. So we weren't trained to think that way. It was like, you're fine until you're not. And to your point about that macro injury, is it even a macro injury, or is it the 10th micro injury that finally the straw that broke the camel's back? And suddenly you're like, oh, there's a problem. It's like, yeah, there's been a problem for weeks, bro. You just didn't see it coming. So
yeah. Nailed it.
So let's talk. So let's say we have a buddy, and they, cause it's never us, and they have low back pain. Let's say someone comes to you and they're like, I love playing pickle. I've got the addiction, but boy, my low back's on fire. Like, what are the first things you're going to think about in terms of how do we address it? We talked about hip mobility, talked about thoracic spine mobility. So kind of what I'm hearing is like, we might look up and down the chain and see how we might get them moving better to take some of that pressure off of getting the low back. Because what we're basically doing, and this is me kind of summing up as I'm going along to make sure I understand this. If in terms of compensating, we're asking the low back, if we don't have good mobility in the hip or in the mid thoracic, we're kind of asking the low back to become more mobile to compensate for that lack of mobility.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. And then that can, if we're talking about a rotation sport, I think that like pickleball,
Yep.
if you're not getting that rotation from those joints and the low back goes to rotate, oftentimes in the low back, that can put a lot of stress on what's called like the facet joint.
Okay.
And over time, that can kind of lead that joint to get irritated.
Got it.
And then now you're having back pain. But as we kind of talked about, the movement impairment is actually coming from that decreased hip mobility or the decreased thoracic mobility.
Bam. Wow. That blows the doors back open on this whole conversation for me about strengthening my low back. Because of course, if you have low back pain, like old school, it's like, well, let's strengthen the core. I'm going to do some core work, on the front side to take the load off the back side. And, 40 years ago, that made sense. But now it's like, oh, but there's a whole nother era or range of things. So how am I moving up here? And for those of you audio, I'm kind of twisting my torso, and how are my hips moving? So we might start prescribing mobility exercises.
Yeah, right away. I mean, I think that's a perfect time early on, and especially like that acute backstage pain where, maybe their tolerance for activity is reduced. Well, we can certainly incorporate some stuff to work on the mobility in their hips and their thoracic spine as we kind of let the fire in the low back area kind of go out.
Yeah.
I think isometric exercises can be very beneficial, not only for the low back in the acute stage, but for a lot of joints. Isometrics are, exercises where, you're holding a muscle contraction, but there's no real movement happening. So you're not getting any like muscle, like fiber tearing that you might get like with, other types of loads.
Gotcha.
So very effective in the early stages. And when you're in pain, I mean, you're not activating your muscles as well. So it is important to get some of those deep core muscles firing to provide some support for that area. Because we know that certain muscles that like multifidi, these are some really deep, small muscles. We see that they're not firing to the same degree that maybe a healthy spine might demonstrate.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so funny, like how as you age, what you work on in terms of strength and maintenance and like the deep core exercises I do now that are all body weight only. And I do them for like a whopping 2 minutes a day, but I do them every morning, in my youth, I never would have bothered. Right. I would have been like,
Right.
what are my beach muscle exercises? How can I look ripped? And now it's like the older I get, the less I actually pick up weights. Like it's so interesting, because there's so much we can do just with our body weight. And like to your point with isometrics, like not even moving, like you're just flexing and holding things and you're just like, this is unbearable. It's almost humbling, how little it takes to actively engage this stuff to get it moving in the right direction.
Yeah, and that's it. I mean, get those muscles activated. And then in the early stage too, we do want to get these people moving as much as they can tolerate.
Yes.
The worst thing that you can do, or the last thing we want people to do is say, I'm just gonna stop doing everything, go lay in bed. Now you're talking about muscles getting weaker and so we want people to get up and moving, whether that's going for a little walk to just get some of the fluids. That's what's going to help bring the nutrients to the area to help it heal up, and then figuring out what other types of movements we can start. Maybe we just modify the ranges within a comfortable range, and then as that fire starts to go out, we can start to progress it and get their confidence back.
Nice. Let's share like one hip mobility exercise and one mid-thoracic mobility exercise that listeners, if they're struggling with low back issues, like start here, do this and this. And this is like a safe way to start moving in the right direction.
Yeah. So when we are talking about like limitations in hip mobility and its correlation with like low back, oftentimes we're talking about like asymmetries actually in hip rotation mobility.
Okay. Yep.
So, hip rotation, we've got internal and external rotation.
Yep.
And so
on both sides.
On both sides. So if we have an asymmetry in between the two hips with rotation, then that's certainly something that we want to address. So one of my favorite exercises for working on like hip mobility for rotation is the hip airplane exercise.
Okay.
So if you can imagine kind of like if anybody's familiar with like a Romanian deadlift or an RDL, you're standing on one leg, and I tell people to hold on because we're not trying to work on balance in this moment.
Okay.
But they're going to hinge forward.
Yeah.
And then they're going to kick the opposite leg back.
Kind of like when an old person tries to take a ball out of the hole
in golf
after they've just sank a putt. They reach down and that back leg goes boop, almost as a counterbalance without them even thinking.
Exactly. Yeah. So we're in that position.
Okay.
And I think what most people think about when they're thinking about hip mobility is the femur, which is, the ball part of the socket moving on your pelvis.
Okay.
Most sports and activities that we're doing, especially in pickleball, the hip rotation that we're talking about is the opposite. It's where the pelvis is moving on the planted leg. So the pelvis needs to be able to move on the femur in this case.
Oh, you just flipped the paradigm right there, mister.
Exactly. So it's a concept that not a lot of people really are aware of.
Yeah.
So in the hip airplane exercise, we're going to get into this position.
Yep.
You're going to imagine that like your pelvis, your rib cage, and your shoulders are like a single unit.
Okay.
And then we're going to focus on getting that pelvis to rotate around your fixed leg.
Huh.
And you go in kind of to both directions. You go up and then you go in.
Wow.
And when you go
I get it.
in towards the leg, you're working on hip internal rotation.
Yeah.
And then when you're going away from it, you're going into hip external rotation.
That's fascinating because every time I've done like internal rotation exercises, I'm moving my leg, not my hip. And what I hear you saying is the whole idea in this case, because functionally, if we look at how this applies in pickleball, you're on a planted leg, right? So you're actually moving the hip, not the leg.
Exactly.
Wow, that's brilliant.
Yeah. So with that exercise, this is why it's a mobility exercise too. It's like you're having to control that, and you're going to feel, you might feel your leg shaking a little bit because it's working to stabilize there.
Yep.
And that's what we want in a sport like pickleball too, because that's where we get our power from, is we're driving from that leg. So it's a great exercise that kind of, and then you'll also see when I watch people perform this exercise, when they're limited, they hit that wall and then they keep trying to rotate. And then that rotation often comes from that lower back area.
Got it. Yeah. I'll move from where I can. And it's like, well, not necessarily. The goal isn't, the goal is proper movement. And I love Arash Maksudi from Prehab was one of my guests. He's a PT also. And he said, the right exercise done the wrong way is the wrong exercise. And I think that's a great phrase, to apply in this case. Like, you're not trying to win an award for how flexible you are. Move properly as far as you can and stay in there, but don't cheat because nobody cares, because nobody's watching. Nobody's keeping score. Hey, congratulations, 27-degree rotation. That was my PR. Let's go. Said no one ever.
Yeah. I mean, you look at athletes across the board in professional sports, and the best players are oftentimes not the ones that are winning in the weight room. They don't have the record for squats or bench press. They're in the weight rooms, trying to move better and move efficiently and stay healthy so that they can continue to play.
Yeah, it's so good. What do you bench? I'm just thinking of all the useless things, right? Like, not relevant anymore. No, really good. So I'm thinking through this hip mobility exercise right now, these airplanes. Do you happen to have any kind of video of you doing one?
I do.
Okay, good. So everyone, you've already seen it because we just had it overlaid while he was describing it, but we didn't talk about this in advance because this is, as you guys know, kind of free form. But that's cool because for you and me, we just watched it. All our listeners just watched that video. So good. Okay, cool. Great. Now let's think mid-thoracic. Like, what's one exercise we can do for mid-thoracic mobility?
Yeah. So when we're talking about mid-thoracic, this is again where if you want to be really effective with your mobility exercises, you have to be really in tune with what areas you're going to compensate from. We talked about how athletes are great compensators, and if you're going to do any, movement occurs in the path of least resistance.
Yes.
So that's what happens when we're doing stretching, mobility work, strength training. So if we're going to address the thoracic spine, one of my favorite exercises for this is to get somebody, they're on their hands and knees.
Okay.
And I have them sit back onto their heels like they're in a child's pose position.
Okay.
And what that does is that locks the lumbar spine in.
Okay.
And then we're kind of propped up on one forearm, and the other hand goes behind the back of your head.
Yeah.
From here, we have to maintain staying seated on our heels.
Yeah.
And then we're going to focus on rotating.
Yeah.
Up and over. And I say, imagine that you're kind of like in a pipe to where you can't shift out of that pipe. You have to really focus on the rotation aspect of it.
Yeah.
And now we've taken every way that you can compensate out of the picture.
Brilliant.
You can't use your low back. You can't side bend your way out of it. And you're going to say, most people are going to say, wow, I really can't move very much this way. And it may even be worse when you go the opposite direction.
Yeah. That's really good. So if I'm on hands and knees and I sit back down, um, are my toes like tucked and I'm sitting on my heels,
Yeah,
or are my
I say
toes?
it probably be, you could do either if it's more
Okay,
comfortable, but
whatever's
I
easier.
probably would do maybe where you're on the top of your feet, actually, where your feet are kind of pointed down.
Pointed down. Yep. I start the morning with a glass of water when I get out of bed first thing after a bio break. And then I go right into that seated position, 30 seconds, sitting upright. Just, holy cow, I can feel like the range of motion in my knees, just like, oh, we're going to open that back up. Um, and then I'll fold over into child's pose for 30 to 60 seconds until my forehead can naturally, in a relaxed state, touch the carpet. And every morning, that's how I start my morning. And the reason why was when I worked in physical therapy, I worked in orthopedic physical therapy, inpatient in the hospital as an aide. And my job was to help total hip and total knee patients get out of bed after surgery and go to PT. And what's one of the number one things we did with total knee patients? Range of motion, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just like, and I'd watch them just crank those legs, right? And they'd have the little meter to measure their rotation and chart on it. And I'd watch them cranking those legs because they had to get that heel to that butt. And I watched people just dying, and I was like, I will never lose that mobility.
Yep.
I will never lose that mobility. I will do it daily for the rest of my life. It scared me straight. So that's totally has nothing to do with that. Sorry, guys. This moment brought to you by ADD. But what I like is so once I've dropped my hips down, let's say I'm going to open up right shoulder, right? So is my left elbow is now on the carpet.
Yeah, your left elbow and forearm are kind of supporting yourself right underneath
right?
you.
So then my right elbow is basically like on the carpet. And then from there, staying in the tube, I'm kind of twisting, taking my elbow almost like a clock. If my elbow's pointing at 6 in a starting position, I'm like, can I even get to 9? And then can I go to 10 without sacrificing that form, right? Am I kind of recreating that?
Yeah, and you're paying attention too, like, how hard am I working? Am I really trying to pull? I mean, we want to see that motion come we want it to be pretty smooth when you're doing it.
I have no rotation, dude. I'm just doing this now. For those of you listening, I'm doing this sitting in my chair, like just mimicking it, and I'm laughing at where my elbow will just immediately where I feel the resistance, like how quickly. It's humbling. And gang, that's good. Right. That's the thing here. We're not here breaking any records. We're not here trying to impress anybody. We're here to improve our mobility, decrease our pain in other parts of our body. So if you find that you can do very little of this, no problem, no big deal. It's not what you can do today. It's what you can do 3 weeks from now if you do it on a regular basis. And that's what's exciting, because you'll be like, I couldn't even do one. And it's like, yeah, no, it's okay. Most people can't. It's not just you. You're not the only one with these issues. So start wherever you are, but please just sacrifice your ego for form over and over and over.
Yeah, I tell my clients that all the time. I'm like, look, if you came to me and everything was perfect and you still had this pain and discomfort, then we'd be in big trouble.
Yeah.
We've got some things that we can work on that you can get better at. And I think that gives you confidence that your situation is going to improve.
Is there a nickname for this exercise that we're talking about, like the opening up the shoulder?
It's called quadruped lumbar locked.
Okay.
T-spine rotation. So I don't have a catchy name for it yet.
Yeah. It just rolls right off the tongue. Right. Rolls right off the tongue. Do you have a video of that?
I have a video of that one as well.
Great. So everybody, I'm glad you just enjoyed that video instead of watching me try to do this sitting upright in my chair on camera. So groovy. That's great. So those are both really specific, really helpful. And I think, the summary in this, everybody, the big takeaway is when you have pain in one part of your body, odds are the cause may not be where the symptom is. And so it's really smart to look up and down the chain, as Brien said, above and below, and checking in like, oh, if I have pain in my low back, which we're talking about today, I'm trying to get mobility out of a stability joint area. And so, okay, then I need where I'm compensating on mobility. Oh, interesting. Okay, so I'm going to work mobility. And by doing that, that takes that pressure off that low back from having to do two jobs, which is mobility and stability, and lets it do what it's designed to do. Rather than I'm going to strengthen my low back and then just keep repeating the same functional mistakes and keep injuring it.
Yeah. And I think there's also a tendency for people to have that symptom in the low back, and there you go, what are some great back stretches? And as we just talked about, this is why people run, they continue to do the stretches, and they're like, well, it's not helping. Well, it's because it's not really a stretching issue.
Yeah, really well said. This is good. We could probably nerd out on this for like 5 more hours. So let's not. Everybody has lives to get to. Brien, where do people find you online?
Yeah. So as you mentioned earlier, I have a podcast, which Tim was honored to have Tim on as a guest. It is the Healthy Pickleballer on Apple and Spotify. And then on social media, you can find me. My handle is the Healthy Pickleballer. So yeah, on pretty much every platform that's out there.
Cool.
And
what if someone wants to work with you? Where do they find you online?
Yeah, they can send me a message directly on through my Instagram or social media handles. I also have a physical therapy practice that I'm the owner of. You can find more information at steamphysicaltherapy.com, and be happy to help if I can.
Awesome. And do you work with people over Zoom?
I do. Yeah, I do online and in person.
Awesome. All right, Brien. Well, thanks for joining us on Pickleball Recovery.
All right. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks so much for listening. Did you know there's one place on the web for all your recovery needs? It's at www.pickleballrecovery.com. You'll find all the products I personally use and recommend, along with exclusive discounts on many of them, as well as my blog where I help you make sense out of all the different products and practices out there to keep you moving and feeling better so you play better. After all, your body is the most expensive piece of equipment you own. Also, do you want to know the number one mistake picklers make that leads to increased pain, soreness, stiffness, and injury? Just head over to pickleballrecovery.com and download my free guide to playing with less pain and more enjoyment. Listen, pickleball makes us feel young at heart, but not young in body. So go download my free guide at www.pickleballrecovery.com. See you next time.